essentially will provide the amount of money they need to keep running this utility like a business. Runs the utility, it's self-supporting off of the revenues it gets, and we look at it like a business, and we'll kind of explain that process today. So in terms of my presentation, I'm going to review the electric rate making process first, what we did in that process, and then discuss exactly how an equity management plan, what an equity management plan is, and how that fits into that rate making process. Then we will look at the results of that rate study that we completed, and what we're doing today is presenting draft results from that study, which essentially we provided to the board approximately a month ago, and then they recommended going to the rate review committee. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, and also to have these public meetings to get input on the different rate options that they're presenting. The rate study is a process of looking at the revenue requirements, the cost of service, and then coming up with rate designs that meets that. In terms of the summary of what I'm going to be saying today, we're basically, the process that we went through was last fall was updating on a pretty general level a study that we did for the district 2 years ago, which looks at the financial projections over a 10-year period. We presented that to the board in a workshop in December, at which point they elected to have us come back and complete a full equity management plan, which is the 2013 equity management plan. A lot of alternatives there.
Richard, excuse me, could you speak a little louder? I see some people straining to hear in the back.
I'm afraid it's going to give me feedback here, but let's just see. If you can't hear me, just raise your hand. One, okay. One behind. Keep going. Okay.
Put more human power behind your voice.
Okay, we will try and keep it as loud as possible. Is that good? Okay. We then met with a rate review panel that looked at the results both of the equity management plan and the rate study, and worked to develop the rate scenarios that we'll be presenting today. We came up with a draft equity management plan and rate proposal in May, and presented that now at the public meetings. The process that we're looking at is for the board to vote on that rate proposal in 1 week, on July 30th, and then to target rate implementation date of September 1st, 2013, if rates are voted on. So let's go through what a rate review process is. It's kind of a mystery for most people. How do you design the rates for the utility? It's kind of a specialized field. As you can see from this is sort of a diagram of the process we go through. We gather a lot of information from the utility on both the customers and their sales projections. We look at over a 10-year period to kind of look at sort of what is the amount of money that they need to get to stay financially sound. And we identify that as a revenue requirement. What's the amount of money the district needs to stay financially sound? Once we've identified that for a test year period, we will then break that up into what's called a cost of service study, looking at various types of customers: residential, commercial, industrial, irrigation, cross control here in Eastern Washington, and basically say how much does it cost the district to provide electric power to each one of those groups. Those classes then, or that kind of information is used to design the rates that we present to customers as part of this, and come up with a rate design. We look at the existing rates, we look at how much they would need to go up if rate change is going to be needed. Then we look at it and say, well, what's the best way to get that? And that's looking at policy objectives, which we will talk about. We then go through a process of checking those and make sure we get the right amount of money that the district needs. And through that, it's kind of an iterative process, and that's what we did with the rate review committee, is look at the rate options, look at the changes in it, make sure that the district over a 3-year period would come up with the revenue it needed. And out of that comes the rate recommendation. So those pieces of it, the first, as I said, is called the revenue requirements. That's kind of a fancy term to say what's the amount of revenue the district needs to get from its rates that are basically going to allow it to stay financially sound and keep providing electric service to its customers. The items we look at in that are operating and maintenance costs. The operations, a lot of that is the purchase power that the district buys from Bonneville Power Administration. We look at other operating costs, which include taxes that they pay. We also look at interest expense that they have. They borrow a lot of money, and we'll talk about how capital intensive the electric utility industry is and how important being able to borrow is in this process. The other side of the equation here is the amount of interest they pay and the depreciation on equipment. On any type of a capital intensive business, you need to be able to generate the costs of the equipment you're buying. Unlike a lot of businesses that just expense things right away, they put so much money into capital, they'll spread it out over a period of time. So if something is expected to have a useful life of, say, 10 years, they'll depreciate it over a 10-year period. So instead of charging ratepayers $1 million in the existing year, they'll charge the customers $100,000 a year for 10 years. Nothing magical, nothing fancy about it, but essentially that way they recover that money and spread it fairly over the useful life of those facilities. We also look at other sources of income the district has. Generally that's interest earnings, but those have really gone down in the last few years. We also have here at the district its wholesale revenue. It has extra power at certain times of the year that it sells on the wholesale market. As we will talk about, those have gone down pretty significantly in the last 5 years. And we look at those and balance it out. And the last piece of it is the margin it needs. Even though the district operates as a public entity on a not-for-profit basis, they need to have extra cushion to basically get to the point where the financial lenders continue to be able to lend them money. If you go to a bank and you say, I want to borrow a certain amount of money, they want to make sure you have the ability to pay it back. That's what they're looking for. And for those of you who've taken out a mortgage, they have sort of ratios they look at, and that's the exact same process we do. So that is how we define the revenue requirements for the district. As I say, the next step in this process is cost of service analysis. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that, but essentially we take that revenue requirement and we break it into the different functions that are provided. We then take it and say, are those fixed costs or are they variable costs? And then take that element and we allocate that to different customers. It's a process of functionalizing, allocating, and then functionalizing, classifying, and allocating the cost. That's in technical terms how they do it. But essentially it's just saying residential customers, we want to look at how much it's costing to provide residential customers power, commercial customers, and industrial. As I mentioned a minute ago, the electric utility industry is very capital intensive. It's quite different than other businesses in that way, because typically about half of the amount of money that they need to get is to pay for the capital that they have. So when we look at an electric utility, what you can see is the different steps we have is you need to be able to generate the power. For the district, they actually purchase most of their power. They don't generate that much, but essentially somewhere it has to be generated. Then at high voltage, it's basically transmitted over the transmission system. They spread it out at high voltage out to the different customers. It then is broken down into transmission substation into lower voltage that allows it to go out to the distribution system. And we have primary distribution and secondary distribution with substations in between. And finally, at the end of the line, we get in the customer. Now, most of us have two ways that we know our electric utilities. We know that when we turn on the power, it comes out of the wall or the lights go on, and we get a bill. That's about it. And most people are not aware of the process that needs to go in, and particularly the amount of fixed cost investment that the utility needs to make to basically make this whole process work. It's very technical, very complicated, and it also needs to be done right. I've been in some other areas of the world where frequencies and voltages go up and down and people have PUD and things like that. Here in the United States, we have incredibly steady power, stays at the right voltage, but they have a lot of equipment in place that allows that to happen. But as we talk about this, one of the concepts that's very important here is the district has a lot of fixed costs that they have to make that the customers don't even know about. One of the changes that's happening is they've got basically the replacement of worn out facilities that are going to be one of the drivers in their projected costs over the next 10 years. So as we talked about that process of how we do the rates, the first piece in this is going to be the equity management plan. Essentially, the equity management plan is a 10-year spreadsheet-based model that projects the financial district's results over the next 10-year period. We look out over 10 years because in the rate-making process, we would really not like to raise our rates a lot right now, especially if we're not going to need money in 5 years. The worst thing for ratepayers is to have a sudden big increase, go a couple of years, have a big increase that puts you back to the same level. You'd like to levelize those costs over time. So a 10-year period is probably more time than we really know, but at least we're looking out long enough to say we'd like to keep the rates steady over that period. We also look at various financial indicators, and as I say, this gets back to sort of what do the banks need, what do the lenders need to loan the district money. We look at various financial metrics. We look at equity and debt. The district borrows a lot of money, and they need to have access to borrow that money. They also have this margin we talked about, and that margin allows them to not borrow quite as much, and that's the balancing act of the equity management plan is, how much do current ratepayers pay versus how much do you have in the long term? You want to spread fairly over time so our children aren't having to pay for what we get the benefit of now. But on the other hand, we don't want to pay for everything that our children are going to have the benefit for. And that's this process of spreading out the costs over time. Part of that is looking at debt options, various financing pieces, and look at the long-term cost impacts of various options that you have for financing. We need to make sure they have enough cash on hand to pay their bills, to pay employees, to pay for the power that they need to get, because there's a lag between when the bills go out and when they get the money from customers. And that's generally called the working capital or the cash needs of the utility. And one of the last things that we do in this whole process, it's the balancing piece, is we look at rate changes that are necessary for the district over time. One of the advantages of doing this is it allows us to look at alternative scenarios or alternative cases of saying, well, what would happen if capital spending is less? What happens if operating costs? What if the cost of our wholesale revenues went up? How would this impact us? And we looked at a lot of different cases with the district, with its board, with the rate review panel, through the equity management plan. So what we're presenting today is sort of the end of essentially about a 6-month process.